How you doing? Somebody asked me about what I believe about God, and I told them that in the world that we live in the physical world we live in, God is absolutely non-existent. God doesn't exist on Earth. He doesn't exist in the universe. He doesn't exist in outer space or on a different planet or anywhere in the cosmos, in the physical world, the world that is bound by the laws of physics. And people are distressed by this because they're like, how can you say you believe in God but you don't believe in God? I didn't say I didn't believe in God. I said I don't believe he exists within this physical world, within the realm of physicality, which is why I believe science can't define God, because they don't have an understanding of anything outside of this physically bound world. We're bound by the laws of physics, and we exist on the precipice of time that exists within this certain dimension. In other words, we are always here and now. We are not in the present or the past, outside of this line. We cannot exist in the physical world and not be on the precipice of time. Therefore, you cannot move forward, or you can't be left behind. You will always be here and now. This brings me to my next point, because we have a certain understanding of these three dimensions, right? We have a pretty good understanding of these three-dimensional objects. We need to move beyond that, and then we have to look at fourth dimension. Now, we can't define this extra axis in the fourth dimension. It's only in theoretical math and science that we can begin to imagine what the fourth dimension would be. But the fourth dimension would add a different complexity to existence, and therefore, with this added, with this extra added complexity to existence, you eliminate a lot of principles that are true in the third dimension. Therefore, you no longer exist in the third dimension at all. You exist in the fourth dimension. Now, if you were in the second dimension, right, and we can examine the relationship between the third and the second dimension. In the second dimension, if you existed, and this is something that Carl Sagan once taught, that you could be influenced by the third dimension, but because you don't have an absolute understanding of that extra axis, you would only feel the third dimension's influence, but you would not understand it. You could not define it, because there's nothing within your second dimension or your 2D life that has a precedence for the third dimension. So it absolutely does not exist, but you could feel its influence. It would be extravagant. It would be miraculous, or miracles, whatever. Anyways, you understand what I'm saying. So that's the relationship between the third and the second dimension. The third dimension completely comprehends the second dimension. Even though the second dimension may seem limitless, even in our third dimension, the limits can be defined to a certain extent. So we can comprehend the entirety of the second dimension. Now, if you were in the second dimension, it would be difficult for you to define the limits of your second dimension, because you're within it. So you're from you're on the inside looking out. Now, when you're on the outside looking in, it's a little bit more clear. So taking that relationship between the third and the second dimension, which are absolutely real in the third dimensional world, except that the second dimension cannot be physically displayed in the third dimension, because it would deteriorate. It would absolutely, it can't exist physically the way that things exist physically in the third dimension. What happens is that you can just think about it here. So it exists here, and in its entirety here in your head as a thought, and as not an idea, but as a fact, that there is a second dimension. There is a flat plane. It is described and explained by mathematics, by our grids, X and Y. And that is the relationship between the second and third dimension. So people in the second dimension world cannot understand fully the third dimension because they're missing that understanding of the z-axis, but they can feel its influence. So we in the second dimension can influence we in the third dimension can influence the second dimension. Now if we step away from that and we start to look at what is in the fourth dimension, right, because we don't have a complete understanding or definition for that extra axis, right, then we start to see that the fourth dimension can influence the third dimension, but it can't be defined or completely understood in the third dimension. So when we talk about the spiritual world, which is thought to be in a realm outside of ours, in order for it to be outside of our realm, it would have to be bigger. Our three-dimensional world is bigger than the second dimension world, so the fourth dimension would have to be bigger than the bounds of the third dimension. So all of the third dimension would have to fit within the fourth dimension. So now if we talk about everything that is the third dimension, we talk about the entire universe has to fit within the fourth dimension, within the bounds of the understanding of the fourth dimension, or else it doesn't exist. So if we have three dimensions, there logically is an infinite number of dimensions. There is no finite end. There's no end as we can perceive it to dimensionality. So we're talking that if we have 1D, then we can stop right there and nothing else can exist outside of that. But that's not true because we have 2D. Okay, so we can just stop at 2D. We don't need anything else. But that's not true because we have 3D. So we can stop at that because this is where we exist. And yeah, that's about the ultimate ending point. This is the end. 3 is a good number, but that's not true because then there's a fourth dimension. Because there are things that happen that are beyond the rules of explanation or the physicality, beyond the explanation of science, these things that we call miracles and phenomena. Now this is the influence of the fourth dimension, and in order to be powerful enough and not be destroyed in the third dimension by manipulating the third dimension, then you have to believe that the influence of phenomena within the third dimension is coming from a dimension greater than the one that exists. So that which we believe is infinite, the universe, has to be finite. And then when we move into the fourth dimension, right? Imagine how small the two-dimensional world is here in our imagination, right? It's small enough to be a thought, right? It's a thought. So the third dimension is only a thought, or within the fourth dimension. The same way that the second dimension is only a thought, and the first dimension are only thoughts inside the third dimension. They don't actually exist here. So in the fourth dimension, we don't exist. We're only a thought in the fourth dimension. And then beyond that, beyond the fifth dimension is with this extra axis, or actually even more axes. It depends on whether when you move up in dimensions the axes are exponential. So you went from 1, 2, 3, 10. You know, are we multiplying here? Are we adding? Are we adding the first and the second dimension to make the third dimension? Are we adding the third and second dimension and the first dimension to make the next dimension, which would technically be 3 plus 3, so it would be technically the sixth dimension, and then we go on exponentially from there. That is unexplained, and that we can't understand because we don't have a definition for an extra axis. We call it spirituality, or the realm outside of here, the fourth dimension, that which is beyond the limits and bounds of infinity as we understand it here. So in that respect, when we come back to this whole God thing, if God exists outside the realm of the third dimension, then by all means, one, he wouldn't exist here. So we wouldn't be able to see him or touch him, but his influence would be felt in the third dimension, and there would be evidence of his influence in the third dimension, right? Also, he could create the third dimension and destroy the third dimension, just the same way we can create a graph and we can destroy the graph inside of our thoughts. The second dimension and third dimension the second and first dimension are just thoughts that can be created and destroyed by a single thought. And as such, I like to say that we are always lost in the vast expanse of God's imagination. It's a play on words, saying that, you know, we exist in the fourth dimension as a thought, and as such we are subject, right, as in our existence, to the fourth dimension. They take precedence over us. The rules of the fourth dimension are greater than the rules of the third dimension. The rules of the third dimension are greater than the rules of the second dimension. Now, if we stop and we think about how many rules govern the third dimension, right, and yet some of them that may not have been examined, we come to the realization that if it was only simply one extra axis to define the fourth dimension or the next dimension outside of our physical reality that is bound by time and the laws of physics, then we must imagine the complexity of the addition of one dimension, or of one axis. And see, the second dimension, there is no gravity, all right, because there's no up or down, left or right. It's flat, left. There's no left, right, up, down are all the same thing. Here in the third dimension, left, right, up, down are all the same thing, but because we have a three-dimensional object, we have what we call mass, and because we have mass, we have gravity. Now we have new rules. Now we have new rules for this mass. The mass must have gravity, and that mass can pull other objects towards it. So now that we're in the third dimension, we've got all these extra special rules. So in the second dimension, an object in the second dimension doesn't necessarily pull another object towards it because it doesn't have mass. So if it doesn't have mass, therefore it doesn't have gravity. And if it doesn't have gravity, they can't attract each other in the second dimension. Therefore, you know, the complexity of our third dimension is exponentially greater in rules than it is in the second dimension. A lot of things start to change in the second dimension. You only have straight lines. You can't have curves in the second dimension. I'm sorry, you can't have curves, and you can have curves in the second dimension. You can't have curves in the first dimension because it has to be a straight line. In the second dimension, you start to have curves. In the fourth dimension, or I'm sorry, in the third dimension, you start to have globes and things that have volume, things of greater complexity. You go from 4 vertices on a square to 8. You double the number of vertices. So in the fourth dimension, we can imagine that something that exists there would have not 4 points or 8 points that where this object meets, but it would have 16. So the complexity of the fourth dimension begins to grow and grow and grow and grow, and so our rules have to change in the fourth dimension. And because we have all these extra rules, the manipulation of the dimensions below us becomes extravagantly easy. Extremely easy. Anybody and everybody that exists within the fourth dimension can, in my theory, manipulate the third dimension. And this theory is based on a theory that was explained by Carl Sagan. Maybe I'll post up his video, but let me know what you think. I can continue this, and we can get a little bit more in depth, try to clarify stuff. I know I kind of just rambled on a little bit. This is not scripted. This is all just a thought. This is all just inside my head. All right, this is stuff I think about every day. Let me know what you think. Adios.